Tomsk, Western Siberia. This secret munitions factory became public knowledge after the fall of the Soviet Union. Here, special capsules known as the Kremlin Pill were made by hand exclusively for the top brass. The health of the leaders of the Soviet Union was always shrouded in secrecy. Private doctors looking after them had a very risky job. Their very lives, not just their careers, were at stake.
Leonid Brezhnev, head of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982. In 1976, Brezhnev suffered clinical death. He had developed asthenia and atherosclerosis, died on November 10, 1982, from heart failure.
During Brezhnev's reign, the term Kremlin medicine acquired special significance. The average age of the Politburo's members was around 80. The country's leaders needed constant medical attention. That's why doctors went through a special procedure to be selected for work at the facility. In his later years, before Brezhnev was due to appear in public, doctors would give him strong drugs to help him focus. Even then, he couldn't concentrate for more than 10 minutes.
Heart attacks and strokes certainly undermined his health. On top of that, Brezhnev was dependent on sleeping pills. All of that together made him completely decrepit.
Nina Korovyakova was Leonid Brezhnev's personal nurse. The elderly general secretary was known to have patronized the woman. At some point, without doctors knowing, she began supplying Brezhnev with large amounts of sleeping pills. The general secretary suffered from insomnia.
When I woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning, I immediately called a Brezhnev aide. I said, "I have a sense there is something wrong with Leonid Brezhnev." "Stop talking nonsense," he replied. "He's okay, everything's normal." But he called me back 3 hours later to say that Brezhnev had died.
The general secretary of the Communist Party was buried in front of the walls of the Kremlin, next to the Lenin Mausoleum on Red Square.
Vladimir Lenin, Ulyanov, founder of the Soviet Union. He was the head of state from 1917 until 1924. In May 1922, he became seriously ill and was almost completely disabled until his death. According to official accounts, he died from atherosclerosis.
Soviet archive footage depicted Lenin as a cheerful man full of energy, capable of working almost round the clock. According to official Soviet records, Lenin was in perfect health. In 1922, Lenin moved into his residence near Moscow. During the last months of his life, he went almost completely insane. This picture was taken by his sister. It and the official diagnosis of the chronic disease that caused his death were hidden from the public for many years.
After foreign doctors came to examine Lenin, they said in letters dated back to 1922 that he had syphilis. The diagnosis was confirmed in 1924 with Lenin's death. Lenin's inner circle was aware of it, but no one else was supposed to know, and the post-mortem report was grossly falsified.
Josef Stalin Jugashvili, Vladimir Lenin's successor, head of state from 1924 till 1953. Before death, he accused his doctors of deliberate malpractice. When he suffered a stroke during the night and did not get up at the usual time, his associates did not have the courage to check on the paralyzed leader for almost a day. Stalin died on March the 5th, 1953, in a coma.
Josef Stalin, the notorious 20th century dictator, had a reputation for being overly suspicious. Millions of people were subjected to political repression under his rule. He was dominated by his phobias. One of his residences was near Lake Ritsa in Abkhazia. Despite the fact it was high in the mountains, it was surrounded by thousands of guards. Even here, Stalin dreaded the prospect of any attempts on his life.
Stalin always sat with his face turned to the windows. In this way, he monitored the situation outside because he was afraid of attempts on his life. Lamps on the walls of the rooms produced a dim glow. Bright lights gave him headaches. Besides, the curtains were trimmed so that he could satisfy himself that nobody outside was going to assassinate him.
A motorboat which shuttled across Lake Gritsa supplied his residents with meals. He abhorred the smell of cooking.
This is one of 3 bedrooms of Josef Stalin. All 3 look quite alike. This is because during the night, Stalin might go to another room to make sure that nobody knew where he was at any particular moment. He feared for his life.
Towards the end of his life, Stalin suspected his doctors of spying. A few dozen medics were arrested under his personal orders. They were brought to the security ministry, where they were forced to say that they had deliberately meted out incorrect diagnosis to put Soviet leaders to death. In 1948, heart specialist Lydia Timoshuk sent a letter to the Kremlin, saying she disagreed with the way doctors had treated Zhudanov, a high-ranking Soviet official. But the Kremlin ignored the letter. However, 4 years later, it was found in archives. By that time, Stalin was already obsessed. He thought physicians were trying to harm him. Timoshuk's letter now provided the basis of a criminal case. Stalin couldn't see the case through, however, as he died on March the 5th, 1953.
I have no doubt that if Stalin had lived long enough, those doctors would have been executed. In light of reports exposing the group of saboteur doctors, even Stalin's death came off as a bad joke. People would say in whispers, "Stalin has been healed to death."
Doctors were released from prison. They were even allowed to resume their work at the Kremlin. A laboratory in Tomsk, Siberia. Here, so-called Kremlin Pills are made. This particular drug is unique. It contains no chemicals and doesn't dissolve in stomach acid. Rather, it is a small electronic device.
The chip inside is 2 by 2 millimeters with 1,000 transistors, super microelectronics in those days.
The Kremlin pill is slightly larger than a bean. Once it is in the body, it starts generating impulses, emulating the rhythms of a young, healthy body. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, pharmacies began selling Kremlin pills. The device was hailed as the cure of the future, and at the beginning, sales skyrocketed.
Somebody had recommended it to me. I thought that if they used it in the Kremlin, it might help my mother, so I bought it.
Dmitri's mother has just gone through complicated abdominal surgery. She has asked doctors for permission to use the Kremlin pill. But will it work?
Nearly all Politburo members lived to a very old age. Their lifespan was about 90 years, whereas ordinary people lived until 50 or 60 on average. Worldly wisdom put their longevity down to some special medicines, including the Kremlin pill.
Yuri Andropov, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee, 1982-1984. Diagnosis: progressive renal failure requiring kidney dialysis. He died on February the 9th, 1984.
Dr. Yevgeny Chazov has cured many Politburo members and was on friendly terms with Andropov for a long time. He knew better than anyone else that Andropov was unfit to rule the country. However, his opinion and that of other Kremlin doctors was not heeded.
I did all I could. I supported Andropov for 18 years. If he'd still been alive and in charge, I'm 99% sure that the Soviet Union would never have collapsed.
At the time he was appointed, Andropov looked different from the other members of the Politburo. He was younger, more energetic, and had a higher IQ. His work schedule was filled with meetings. But those closest to him knew that every day doctors used to connect Andropov to a kidney dialysis machine.
It was a cumbersome piece of equipment. Our doctor colleagues were working on a miniature machine the size of a briefcase. They did create something of that kind, but regrettably, it was too late for them to put it to use.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the newspaper Pravda blamed Dr. Chazov and other Kremlin doctors for the spate of Soviet leaders' deaths.
I took the newspaper and came to a meeting of academics. I said, "Dear colleagues, I have to tell you that 12 of you sitting here are going to be subject to prosecution." After they heard that, they decided to write an official letter to Pravda newspaper that said, "You're making a second case against doctors." Now, Pravda was so intimidated by that they decided to publish it.
Nikita Khrushchev, head of the USSR from 1953 to 1964. No chronic diseases were detected in him during his stint in office. The only Soviet leader removed from power for what was officially described as health reasons, died at the age of 77, 7 years after his resignation.
According to his contemporaries, Khrushchev was healthier than any other Soviet leader. Unlike Brezhnev, he didn't care much for ready-made scripts of his speeches and instead often improvised. A doctor did accompany him during his international visits, but only to be on the safe side. Her job was to give Khrushchev medical assistance of a special kind. The fact is that he was not the calmest of politicians.
The only other person in the medical profession was a fairly young lady, a throat specialist. But that had nothing to do with the permanent state of his health. It was simply because he talked too much and too loudly. So it affected his vocal cords. So what she had to do was to give him spray some stuff inside his throat.
Boris Yeltsin, President of Russia, 1991-1999, suffered from heart disease. 8 years after his resignation, he died of progressive cardiovascular and multiple organ failure in April 2007.
In the early 1990s, many saw Yeltsin as a hero. In August 1991, he stood at the head of a movement of resistance to plotters who wanted to preserve the Soviet regime. He displayed energy and resolution. Before long, however, rumors creeping around Moscow were claiming that sharing a banquet table with Yeltsin was fraught with unpredictable consequences. When Yeltsin was a young man, he was an enthusiastic and skillful sportsman. This helped his career in the Communist Party in the Urals. Here he was reputed to be a no-nonsense, tough administrator. Nobody would ever dare to pull the wool over his eyes. After he moved to Moscow to take the post of president, quite a few people among his associates were noted for weird practices. One of them, Yuri Manin, was a professional psychic.
I said it was possible to improve ratings, so much so that they would be beyond the reach of opponents. Give me 45 minutes of any main TV state channels, and the certain candidate would be elected. This is called the management of the collective mind, the management of the audience.
On the eve of the 1996 elections, President Yeltsin was going out of his way to demonstrate that he was physically fit for another term of office. He was indeed elected for a second stint, but he paid a price for his exertion. Yeltsin urgently needed heart bypass surgery.
Because of all the stress, the contraction function of his heart was a ruin. The only person who said there was a chance of success was me. I said that we should prepare him for the surgery.
After the operation, Boris Yeltsin stayed at the helm of the nation for nearly 4 more years. He resigned on the last day of the 20th century.
I am leaving. I did what I could.
The Yeltsin era has already receded into history. Many myths about Kremlin medicine are gradually fading. Sales of the miracle Kremlin pill have almost fizzled out, despite being described as a cure-all. Dmitry, the young man who bought the Soviet device for his mother, only found out a short time ago that it had nothing to do with the Kremlin at all. It was just a bogus promotional campaign launched soon after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Of course, I was somewhat surprised because there was a legend attached to the pill. When you first hear about it, what immediately attracts you is its name.
So you take a pill, and afterwards you live for 200 years? Well, it's just nonsense. Don't believe that rubbish.
Stringent selection procedures are still applied to doctors wishing to join the system of medical care provided for the country's topmost officials. It is an established fact that the Kremlin's inhabitants no longer turn to healers or clairvoyants. However, what they do to keep fit and how the Kremlin's doctors protect them from ill health is still a state secret.